James Cooper pulled his truck to the side of the road as rain pounded against his windshield. The wipers fought against the downpour, but visibility was still poor. He squinted through the glass, noticing a small figure huddled under the awning of the closed convenience store. At 48 years old, James had lived his entire life in Millfield, a small town in Georgia where everyone knew everyone's business. People knew James as the tough construction foreman who didn't mince words. They also knew his views about keeping to your own kind, views he never tried to hide. Lightning flashed, illuminating the huddled figure more clearly. It was a boy. Couldn't be more than 12 or 13, black, with a small backpack clutched to his chest. The child wore a thin jacket that was doing little against the cold April rain. James's first instinct was to drive on, not his problem. Something made him pause. Maybe it was how small the boy looked, or how the lightning had shown his face for just a moment, determined, not frightened, despite his situation. "Damn it," James muttered, putting the truck in park. He sat there for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel. Finally, he grabbed his umbrella from the back seat and stepped out into the rain. The boy looked up as James approached, immediately tensing. His eyes showed wariness beyond his years. "You lost, kid?" James asked gruffly, keeping his distance. The boy shook his head. "No, sir." "Well, you sure look lost, sitting out here in the rain." James shifted uncomfortably. "Where's your folks?" "Don't have any," the boy answered simply. James frowned. "Everyone's got somebody. Where you staying?" The boy just shrugged, looking away. Another crack of lightning made them both jump, followed immediately by a deafening boom of thunder. The rain intensified, now coming in sideways and reaching under the store's awning. "Look," James said, "you can't stay here. Store's closed till morning, and this storm's getting worse." He pointed to his truck. "I can take you to the police station. They'll figure out where you belong." Fear flashed across the boy's face. "No police, please." James sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You in some kind of trouble?" "No, sir, just don't want to go back to the last home." The words hung between them as James understood what the boy wasn't saying. He'd heard stories about bad foster homes, but had always figured they were exaggerated. "What's your name?" James asked. "Marcus." "I'm James Cooper." He hesitated, then added, "I got a spare room. You can stay the night, get dry, and we'll figure something out tomorrow." Marcus looked skeptical. "Why would you help me?" It was a good question. James wasn't sure of the answer himself. "Because it's pouring, and I'm not leaving a kid out in this weather. Even I'm not that heartless." After a moment's consideration, Marcus nodded and stood up. James noticed he moved carefully, like someone who expected to be hit. As they walked to the truck, neighbors driving by slowed down to stare. James Cooper, giving a ride to a black kid. The town gossips would have a field day. Inside the truck, Marcus sat as close to the door as possible, his backpack clutched like a shield. "Hungry?" James asked, starting the engine. Marcus nodded slightly. "We'll stop for burgers," James decided, pulling back onto the road. As they drove through the rain-soaked streets, James couldn't help wondering what he was doing. He had no business taking in some random kid, especially not this kid, yet here he was, doing exactly that. Little did he know, this rainy evening would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. The burger wrappers sat crumpled on James's kitchen table. Marcus had eaten his food quickly, like someone afraid it might be taken away. Now he sat on the edge of his chair, eyes darting around the living room of James's small house. "Bathrooms down the hall," James said, pointing. "Spare rooms next to it." His voice was gruff, uncomfortable. He hadn't had a guest in years, let alone a child. "Thank you, sir," Marcus replied politely. James nodded stiffly. "Got some old clothes might fit you. They'll be big, but they're dry." He didn't explain they were from when his nephew visited years ago, before James had fallen out with his sister. While Marcus showered, James made up the spare bed. His hands felt clumsy as he tucked in corners of sheets that hadn't been used in ages. The whole situation felt wrong. What was he thinking, bringing this kid home? People would talk. Mrs. Winters from next door had already peeked through her curtains when they pulled up. By morning, the whole town would know. Marcus appeared in the doorway, swimming in the borrowed t-shirt and sweatpants. His hair was still damp, his skinny arms poking out of sleeves that hung past his elbows. "Those'll do for sleeping," James said, focusing on making the bed rather than looking at the boy. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." "Are you going to call social services?" Marcus asked quietly. James paused. "Have to, kid. That's the law." "They'll just put me back in another home." Marcus's voice remained calm, but his fingers twisted the edge of the oversized shirt. "What happened at the last place?" James asked, finally turning to look at him directly. Marcus shrugged, eyes on the floor. "Mr. Reeves drank a lot. When he drank, he got mad. When he got mad, he trailed off." James felt something twist in his chest. He recognized the signs. The careful way Marcus moved, how he flinched at sudden movements. James had seen it in some of the guys at the construction site who'd come from rough homes. "Did you tell anyone?" "Mrs. Reeves said nobody would believe me." Marcus looked up briefly. She was right. James sighed heavily. He should just call the police now. Get this over with. The kid wasn't his problem. They didn't even look like they belonged in the same house. "Get some sleep," he said instead. "We'll deal with it tomorrow." Later that night, James sat in his recliner, unable to sleep. The sound of rain had stopped, leaving the house unusually quiet. He could hear the occasional crate from the spare room, Marcus turning over, probably also awake. James's phone buzzed with a text. It was from Dadle, his foreman buddy. "Heard you picked up a stray. That true?" News traveled fast in Millfield. James didn't reply. His living room walls were covered with fishing photos and a Confederate flag his grandfather had given him. He never thought twice about that flag before. Now, with the black kid sleeping down the hall, James felt a strange discomfort looking at it. Around midnight, James heard a noise from the kitchen. He found Marcus getting a glass of water, moving carefully like he was trying not to be heard. "You can eat if you're hungry," James said, making Marcus jump. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." "I'm okay, sir, just thirsty." James opened the refrigerator. "Got milk, juice, soda, water's fine too." Marcus hesitated. "Water's good." As the boy drank, James noticed a bruise on his wrist that hadn't been visible earlier. The sight made something harden in his chest. "Listen," James said, surprising himself. "Maybe we don't need to call anyone right away. Maybe you can stay here a couple days till we figure things out." Marcus looked up, suspicious hope in his eyes. "Why would you do that?" It was the second time the boy had asked him that question. James still didn't have a good answer. "Because sometimes the system doesn't work like it should," he finally said. "And nobody deserves what you've been through." As Marcus headed back to bed, James remained in the kitchen, wondering what he'd just gotten himself into. His friends would never understand. He barely understood it himself. 3 days had passed since James brought Marcus home. The promised call to social services remained unmade. Each morning, James convinced himself he would make the call after work. Each evening, he found a reason to put it off another day. On the fourth morning, James woke to the smell of something burning. He rushed to the kitchen to find Marcus frantically waving a dish towel at the smoking toaster. "I'm sorry." Marcus backed away quickly. "I wanted to make breakfast. I thought." James moved past him and unplugged the toaster, dumping the blackened bread into the sink. "It's fine, kid. Just toast." Marcus stood tensely, as if waiting for the explosion of anger. When none came, the shoulders slowly relaxed. "Never used a toaster before?" James asked, opening a window to let the smoke out. "Not this kind," Marcus admitted. "The ones at the shelter had a timer." James nodded, processing this new piece of information. "Shelter, huh? Thought you said foster homes." "Both." Marcus sat down at the kitchen table. "My mom died when I was 8. Cancer. I stayed at the shelter until they found me a place. Been in 3 homes since then." The matter-of-fact way he stated this made James's chest tighten uncomfortably. "What about your dad?" Marcus shrugged. "Mom never told me much about him. Just that he was a soldier and died before I was born." James pulled out eggs from the refrigerator. "I can teach you how to work the toaster properly after breakfast." While they ate, Marcus's eyes kept drifting to James's truck keys on the counter. "Something on your mind?" James asked. "I like trucks," Marcus said quietly. "Used to draw them a lot." "You draw?" Marcus nodded. "When I can get paper and pencils." After breakfast, James dug through a drawer and found an old notepad and some pencils. He handed them to Marcus, who accepted them with surprised gratitude. Later that afternoon, James returned from a trip to the store to find Marcus sitting on the porch steps, intently focused on the notepad. "What you working on there?" James asked, carrying grocery bags past him. Marcus hesitated, then turned the pad around. James stopped in his tracks. The boy had drawn James's truck with remarkable detail, down to the dent in the rear bumper and the cracked side mirror. "That's actually really good," James said, genuinely impressed. "You did this from memory?" Marcus nodded. "I notice how things fit together." "You ever think about being an engineer or something?" James asked, continuing into the house. "Maybe, if I get to finish school somewhere." The comment hung in the air between them, a reminder of Marcus's uncertain situation. That evening, the doorbell rang. James opened it to find Sheriff Donaldson standing on his porch. "Evening, James," the sheriff said, his eyes scanning past James into the house. "Mind if I come in?" James stepped aside reluctantly. Marcus was in the living room, immediately tensing at the sight of the uniform. "This the boy I've been hearing about?" Sheriff Donaldson asked. "This is Marcus," James confirmed stiffly. "Marcus, Sheriff Donaldson." "Hello, sir," Marcus said politely, though his body language was guarded. The sheriff nodded. "James, can I talk to you outside for a moment?" On the porch, Sheriff Donaldson crossed his arms. "Got a call from Susan Winters next door. Says you got a kid here who doesn't belong to you." "He needed help," James said defensively. "You know I should take him in right now," the sheriff said. "There are procedures for this sort of thing." James's jaw tightened. He ran away from his last home because they were hurting him. System failed him. "And you're what?" "Fixing the system now." The sheriff looked skeptical. "Since when do you care about—" He stopped himself. "About black kids?" James finished for him. "I'm just trying to do right by him until we figure something out." The sheriff studied James for a long moment. "I can give you 3 days to contact social services yourself. After that, I have to report this." After the sheriff left, James found Marcus sitting tensely on the couch. "Am I going back?" he asked quietly. James sat heavily in his recliner. "Not yet, but we need to figure something out." That night, James lay awake, thinking about Marcus's drawing skills and his story about a soldier father. Something nagged at the back of his mind, a connection he couldn't quite make. Whatever it was, he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't ready to send Marcus back into the system. Saturday morning meant cleaning day. James had always kept to this routine, and having Marcus in the house didn't change that. He assigned the boy to dust the living room while he tackled the kitchen. "What about this closet?" Marcus asked, pointing to the hall closet James always kept closed. James looked up from scrubbing the sink. "Leave that one. It's just storage." Marcus nodded and continued with his dusting. The boy had proven himself helpful over the past week, eager to earn his keep. James had to admit he was a good kid, respectful, quiet, and smart. Twice now, Marcus had helped him fix things around the house, showing an intuitive understanding of how mechanical objects worked. Later that afternoon, while James was in the shower, the peaceful quiet was broken by a loud crash. He rushed out, a towel wrapped around his waist, to find Marcus standing frozen beside the open hall closet. A box had fallen, its contents scattered across the floor. "I'm sorry," Marcus said immediately, his body tense. "I was looking for the vacuum. I didn't mean to." "It's fine," James cut him off, seeing the fear in the boy's eyes. "Just pick it up." As Marcus bent to gather the fallen items, he paused, holding something in his hands. It was a photograph, old and slightly faded, protected in a simple frame now cracked from the fall. James felt his stomach drop, of all the things to find. The photo showed 2 young men in military uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a desert backdrop. One was a younger James, his hair darker and face less lined. The other was a tall black man with a brilliant smile. They both looked happy, carefree despite the war zone around them. "Who is this?" Marcus asked, unable to hide his curiosity. James walked over slowly and took the photo. He stared at it for a long moment before speaking. His name was Deshaun. Deshaun Williams. James's voice was rough with emotion he rarely showed. "We served together in Iraq. First Gulf War." Marcus's eyes widened. You were friends. The surprise in the boy's voice might have angered James once, but now it just made him sad. Best friends, he said simply. We went through basic training together. Spent 2 tours side by side. James sat heavily on the hallway floor, still holding the photo. Marcus hesitated, then sat cross-legged across from him, waiting. Deshaun was from Atlanta. James continued, surprising himself by sharing this story he hadn't spoken of in years. Smart as hell. Could have been an officer, but he wanted to stay with the regular guys. Said that's where he could do the most good. What happened to him? Marcus asked quietly. James's jaw tightened. Our convoy hit an IED. Vehicle flipped. I was trapped inside when a second explosion hit nearby. He tapped the photograph gently. Deshaun pulled me out. Got me clear before the fuel tank went up. He saved your life, Marcus said. James nodded. Yes, and lost his own doing it. They sat in silence for a moment. Marcus looked at the scattered contents of the box. More photos, military medals, folded letters. If he was your best friend, Marcus finally asked, why do you keep his picture hidden in a closet? The question hit James like a physical blow. How could he explain to this child the complicated mess of guilt, grief, and shame that had twisted inside him for years? How after Deshaun died, he returned home to find comfort in the familiar prejudices of his community rather than honoring his friend's memory. Because I'm a coward, James finally said. It was easier to forget than to remember. Marcus picked up another photo that had fallen, this one showing Deshaun in civilian clothes with a young woman. Is this his girlfriend? James looked at the photo. His sister, Letitia. He frowned suddenly, looking more closely at the woman's face, then back at Marcus. Something in his expression shifted as recognition dawned. What is it? Marcus asked. James stared at the boy, seeing features he should have noticed before, the shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. Marcus, he said slowly, what was your mother's name? Letitia, Marcus replied. Letitia Williams. The hallway seemed to spin around James as the impossible connection clicked into place. This wasn't just any homeless kid he'd taken in. This was Deshaun's nephew, the family he had promised to look after and then abandoned. James sat at his kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. It was past midnight, but sleep wouldn't come. Across from him sat a photo of Deshaun and Letitia Williams, propped against the sugar bowl. In the spare room, Marcus slept, unaware of the storm of emotions raging through James. I should have known, James whispered to the photograph. Should have seen it in his face. His mind traveled back to that terrible day in Iraq, the heat, the explosion, the pain, and Deshaun dragging him from the burning vehicle, saying, Not today, Cooper, you're going home. Then came the second explosion. After that, only fragments of memory remained, waking up in a field hospital, being told Deshaun didn't make it, the funeral back home weeks later. James remembered meeting Letitia there. Beautiful, heartbroken Letitia, 7 months pregnant, and now without her brother. I'll look out for you and the baby, James had promised her, gripping her hand. Anything you need. Deshaun was my brother too. But he hadn't kept that promise. After returning to Millfield, James had sunk into a dark place. The nightmares, the drinking, the guilt. It became easier to ignore calls from Atlanta than to face Deshaun's family. Then came the rumors about Letitia's baby, that the father might have been white. The whispers that reached even Millfield suggested Deshaun had been angry about it. None of that should have mattered, but somehow James let it become another excuse to stay away. Months became years. James built walls around himself, retreating into the comfortable prejudices of his small town. Eventually, he stopped thinking about his promise altogether. Until now. A floorboard creaked, pulling James from his thoughts. Marcus stood in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Couldn't sleep? James asked. Marcus shook his head. Had a bad dream. James pulled out a chair. Want some milk or something? Marcus sat down, his eyes falling on the photograph. That's my mom, he said softly. Yes, James pushed the photo toward him. She was beautiful. She talked about Uncle Deshaun a lot. Marcus said, tracing his finger over the image, said he was a hero. Said he had a friend who promised to help us, but he never came. The words struck James like physical blows. Did she ever mention his name? This friend? James Cooper, Marcus said. She used to check the phone book whenever we moved to a new place. She thought maybe he lived nearby and would help if he knew where we were. James closed his eyes, the weight of his failure crushing him. I'm so sorry, Marcus. Marcus looked up, confusion on his face. For what? I'm James Cooper, he admitted. I'm the friend who promised to help and never did. Marcus's eyes widened. You? But... He looked around the kitchen, at the Confederate flag magnet on the refrigerator, at James' weathered face. Mom said you were kind, that you cared about people. I was different then, James said quietly. After the war, after your uncle died saving me, I changed, became someone he wouldn't recognize. He ran a hand over his face. Someone he wouldn't like very much. Is that why you took me in? Marcus asked. Because you knew who I was. No, James shook his head. I had no idea who you were until today. It was just. Something made me stop that night in the rain. They sat in silence for a long moment. Your mom? James finally asked. What happened to her? Cancer, Marcus said simply. Same kind her mom had. After she died, there was no other family. That's when I went into foster care. James nodded, thinking of all the years wasted, all the help he could have provided. Did she suffer? At the end, Marcus admitted. The hospital bills took everything we had. We lost our apartment. She had to stop treatments early. Each word was another indictment of James's broken promise. If he had been there, things might have been different. Letitia might have had proper care. Marcus might never have known homelessness or abusive foster homes. I can't change the past, James said finally, but I can try to do right by you now, if you'll let me. Marcus studied him carefully. Why would you want to? You didn't seem to like people like me when you picked me up. People change, James said. Sometimes they need a good reason. Monday morning arrived with a sense of urgency. The sheriff's 3-day deadline was up. James sat at his kitchen table, phone in hand, Marcus across from him eating cereal. You're calling them today? Marcus asked, trying to sound casual though his knuckles were white around his spoon. James nodded. But not social services. At least, not yet. He dialed a number and put the phone to his ear. Hey Dale, it's me. Listen, I need to take some time off. Family emergency. Yeah, about 2 weeks should do it. Thanks, I appreciate it. Marcus looked up in surprise as James hung up. First, James said, we're going to Atlanta. Need to see about your mother's affairs, find her paperwork, talk to her doctors. Then we'll figure out next steps. Are you serious? Marcus asked. Dead serious, James replied. Get your things together. The drive to Atlanta took 4 hours. They spent most of it in silence, the radio playing softly between them. Occasionally, James would ask Marcus about his mother, where they had lived, what she had been like in her final days. Each answer formed another piece of the puzzle, another opportunity James had missed to honor his promise to Deshawn. In Atlanta, they found the small apartment building where Letitia had last lived. The landlord remembered her. Sweet lady, the older woman said, shaking her head sadly. Boy disappeared after they took her to hospice. Thought he might have gone to relatives. I am family, James said firmly, surprising himself. Just took me too long to get here. They visited the hospital next, then the hospice center. At each stop, James explained his relationship to Marcus, carefully omitting the years of absence. He collected medical records and outstanding bills, wincing at the amounts Letitia had been unable to pay. By evening, they'd had a folder full of documents and a clearer picture of Marcus's situation. In a motel room on the outskirts of Atlanta, James spread the papers across a small table. Your mom had a lot of debt, he explained to Marcus. Medical bills mostly. But there's something else here. He held up a life insurance policy. Deshawn took this out before his last deployment. Listed your mom as beneficiary. Looks like she never claimed it. Marcus leaned forward. What does that mean? Means there's money that's rightfully yours, James said. Not a fortune, but enough to help with your education. The next morning, they visited a lawyer who specialized in military benefits. The meeting was brief but productive. The lawyer promised to help file the necessary paperwork to claim Deshawn's insurance policy for Marcus. As for custody, the lawyer said, looking between them, That's more complicated. You're not a blood relative, Mr. Cooper. But I'm the closest thing to family he's got, James insisted. His uncle was my best friend. I promised to look after them. The lawyer nodded thoughtfully. We could try for emergency foster placement as a first step. Given the circumstances, you might have a chance, but it won't be easy. On the drive back to Millfield, James was quiet, deep in thought. The radio played softly as Marcus dozed in the passenger seat. Marcus, James said finally, causing the boy to stir. I want to ask you something important. Marcus sat up, suddenly alert. Would you want to stay with me? Permanently, I mean. The question hung in the air between them. Why? Marcus asked. Because I made a promise to your uncle, James began, then shook his head. No, that's not right. It started as a promise, but now, he struggled to find the words. You're a good kid, smart, deserve a chance. Marcus looked out the window at the passing landscape. People in your town wouldn't like it. Probably not, James admitted. Some of them anyway. Your friends? James gripped the steering wheel tighter. If they can't accept it, they're not really friends. As they approached Millfield, James steeled himself for what was to come. The stares, the whispers, the judgment. Sheriff Donaldson would be waiting. So would a mountain of paperwork and legal hurdles. None of it would be easy, but for the first time in years, James felt like he was doing something that mattered. So, he asked again as they passed the town limits sign. What do you think? Would you want to stay? Marcus studied James's face for a long moment, then nodded. I think my mom would have wanted that. And Uncle Dishon too. James swallowed the lump in his throat. Then we better get home and start figuring this out. You've lost your damn mind, Cooper, Dale said, shaking his head. They stood beside James's truck in the construction site parking lot, James's first day back after his leave. Maybe I have, James replied, loading his toolbox. But my mind's made up. Word had spread quickly through Millfield. James Cooper was trying to become foster parent to a black boy, the same James Cooper who had once refused to attend his own niece's wedding because she was marrying a Hispanic man. People are talking, Dale continued, saying you've gone soft, or worse. Let them talk, James said firmly. Doesn't change anything. The past month had been a whirlwind of paperwork, interviews, and home visits. Social worker Ms. Patel had been skeptical at first, especially after seeing the Confederate flag in James's living room. That came down weeks ago, James had told her, pointing to the bare spot on the wall. Didn't feel right anymore. Now, with temporary emergency placement approved, Marcus was officially living with James. The arrangement was conditional: monthly check-ins, parenting classes for James, and therapy for both of them. At work, things were tense. Some of the crew avoided James. Others made thinly veiled comments when he walked by. Only a few, like Rodriguez from Electrical, made a point of treating him normally. My kids are about Marcus's age, Rodriguez told them during lunch break. Maybe they could hang out sometime. James nodded, surprised and grateful. He'd like that. The biggest challenge came when Marcus started at Millfield Middle School. Principal Freeman had called James in for a meeting before classes began. I want to be clear, Mr. Cooper, she said, her dark eyes studying him carefully. We don't tolerate racism at this school, from students or parents. Neither do I, James replied, holding her gaze. Not anymore. Principal Freeman's eyebrows rose slightly, but she nodded. Marcus has had disruptions in his education. They'll need extra support. Whatever he needs, James promised. I'm all in on this. That commitment was tested when Marcus joined the school's robotics club. The first competition was in Savannah, a 3-hour drive away. You don't have to come, Marcus told him the night before. I know you're busy. James looked up from where he was washing dishes. Course I'm coming. Already took the day off. The robotics competition opened James's eyes to a world he never knew existed. Bright kids of all colors working together, building incredible machines. Marcus's team, mostly white kids from Millfield, had accepted him immediately once they saw his talent for mechanical design. James sat awkwardly among the other parents, feeling out of place in his work boots and flannel shirt among their pressed cakeis and polo shirts. Which one's yours? Asked a woman beside him. James pointed to Marcus, who was hunched over their robot, making last-minute adjustments. The one in the blue shirt. If she was surprised, she didn't show it. My daughter's on the same team. Says your boy's a mechanical genius. He is, James said, not bothering to correct her assumption about Marcus being his son. Somehow, it felt right. When Marcus's team won third place, James cheered louder than anyone. The smile on Marcus's face when he looked up and saw James was worth every uncomfortable moment. That night, driving home with the small trophy on the dashboard, James asked, "You have fun today?" Marcus nodded, then hesitated. Mr. Rodriguez asked if I wanted to come over tomorrow. His son has a new video game system. Want me to take you over there? James offered. Yeah, Marcus said quietly. But what? Some of the other kids asked if I was really living with you, they said. Marcus trailed off. Said what? James prompted gently. Said you were the town racist. That you had Confederate flags all over your house and that you hated people like me. James gripped the steering wheel tightly. It hurt because it had been true, not so long ago. People change, Marcus, he said finally. Sometimes it takes something big to make them see how wrong they've been. Marcus looked at him curiously. Is that what happened to you? James thought about the photograph of Deshawn, now framed on their living room wall instead of hidden in a closet. He thought about his broken promise and the chance of redemption sitting beside him. Yeah, he said softly. That's exactly what happened. The county courthouse buzzed with quiet conversation as people filed into the adoption hearing. James sat stiffly in his best suit, bought specially for this day, tugging at the collar that felt too tight around his neck. Beside him, Marcus fidgeted in his new clothes, looking both nervous and excited. Lot of people here, Marcus whispered, glancing around the crowded room. James nodded, equally surprised. He had expected Ms. Patel, their lawyer, and maybe Principal Freeman. Instead, it seemed half of Millfield had shown up. Rodriguez and his family sat in the row behind them. Several of Marcus's robotics team members waved from across the aisle. Even Sheriff Donaldson stood at the back, arms crossed but expression softer than usual. Most surprising was the presence of Dale and 3 other men from the construction crew. They had barely spoken to James in months, yet here they were, awkwardly holding their hats in their hands. All rise, called the bailiff as Judge Watkins entered. The proceedings began formally, with their lawyer presenting the final adoption petition. The past 18 months had been a long journey, from emergency placement to formal fostering, and now, finally, adoption. Mr. Cooper, Judge Watkins said, peering over her glasses, I've reviewed your file extensively. Your background checks, home studies, and character references. She paused. I must say, some aspects of your history raised concerns. James felt his stomach tighten. This was it, the moment when his past would ruin everything. However, the judge continued, the reports from Ms. Patel show remarkable change and commitment. Would you like to address the court about why you wish to adopt Marcus? James stood slowly, his hands shaking slightly. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. He had practiced what to say, but now the words fled his mind. He looked at Marcus, then out at the crowded courtroom, faces from a town that had known him at his worst, watching to see if his change was real. 2 years ago, James began, his voice rough with emotion, I was a different man, the kind of man who judged others by the color of their skin, the kind who'd forgotten promises made to a friend who died saving my life. He pulled a folded photograph from his pocket, Deshawn in his uniform, smiling. This was Marcus's uncle, my best friend in the army. He died a hero, and I repaid him by turning my back on everything he stood for. James took a deep breath. Then, by some miracle, I found Marcus. Or maybe he found me. James turned to look directly at the boy who had changed his life. People think I saved him that rainy night. Truth is, he saved me from a lifetime of hate and ignorance I didn't even know was killing me. Tears welled in James's eyes, but he didn't try to hide them. I'm not adopting Marcus because of a promise I made 20 years ago. I'm adopting him because he's the son I never had. Because I love him, because we're family now, and nothing, not color, not blood, not the opinions of others, matters more than that. The courtroom was silent when James finished. Even Judge Watkins seemed moved. Marcus, she said gently, would you like to say anything? Marcus stood, shoulders straight despite his nervousness. When my mom died, I thought I'd never have a family again, he said clearly. The foster homes? They weren't good places. He glanced at James. But then I met James. He was grumpy and scary at first. A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the courtroom. But he kept his promise to help me, even though it was hard, even when people were mean to him about it. Marcus's voice grew stronger. He comes to all my robotics competitions. He helped me build a workshop in the garage. He makes terrible pancakes but tries anyway. More laughter, including from James himself. He's my dad now, Marcus concluded simply. Not because some paper says so, but because we chose each other. Judge Watkins nodded, a smile touching her lips. In light of the evidence presented and the obvious bond between you, I am pleased to approve this adoption. Congratulations to you both. As applause filled the courtroom, James pulled Marcus into a tight hug. Over the boy's shoulder, he caught sight of Dale and the crew, standing and clapping along with everyone else. Outside the courthouse, people gathered to congratulate them. Rodriguez slapped James on the back. Principal Freeman shook his hand warmly. Even Dale approached, looking uncomfortable but determined. You did good, Cooper, Dale said gruffly. Different, but good. James nodded, his arm around Marcus's shoulders. Sometimes different is exactly what's needed. As they walked to the truck, now a family in name and in heart, Marcus looked up at James. What now? James smiled. Now, we go home. Together.